Hello, and welcome to the fourth episode of Reuters Events Zeroing In, a series designed to explore the big topics and debates as we move through the energy transition. My name is Owen. I lead the energy transition team here at Reuters Events, and I will be your chair today. Thank you to all of you joining us and to those listening now on demand. Whilst the energy transition promises a shift towards a low carbon economy, the debate as to what will fuel this transition remains open. This episode will zero in on this debate and explore the dual challenge posed by growing energy demand and the wider transition, with a key focus on the hydrogen economy. As ever, this is an interactive discussion, so do get your questions coming in through the Q&A function, and we'll see how many we can get to as we move through or at the end. Joining me today, I have a world-leading panel of experts and have the pleasure of now introducing them. Anna Qualkas, Managing Director for Hydrogen at EDP, Paul Bogers, Vice President of Hydrogen at Shell, and Dr. Sunita Satyapal, Director of the Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Technologies Office for the US Department of Energy. Thank you all for joining us. Anna, let's come to you first. Can you set the scene for us a little here? I know your role has recently changed from strategic and corporate energy planning at EDP into a more hydrogen focused role. So how are you planning for the future energy system, and how does hydrogen come into this new strategy for EDP?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to be here and sharing some thoughts with you. It's really a pleasure for me. In fact, I just changed roles internally. So before I was responsible for the energy planning for EDP, which is really, the team that oversees the long-term trends of the sector, trying to anticipate in them. And I think the challenges are very clear, the challenges ahead of us, and very global, and not just the energy ones. We have the population growing, we have the climate changing, we have an increased need for demand, and all of that under the great challenge of being able to do that in a sustainable way. So indeed, within this context, the energy sector as a whole is under profound transformation and a profound challenge. I think there are many trends that are very consensual. The need to increase our energy efficiency efforts, the increased use of renewable energies, the trend towards the electrification of demand, the direct electrification of demand. And of course, if we are really committed to full decarbonization, we have to be aware that not all energy consumption will be able to be directly electrified. And so it's exactly for those needs, for those particular needs, that hydrogen, renewable hydrogen, comes into play. And that's, I guess, why we're all here today around this table talking about hydrogen.
Thanks, Anna, and yeah, absolutely. We'll come back to some of the points you mentioned there. Paul, likewise, thank you for joining us. Perhaps to start with, you could talk to us a little bit more around Shell's approach to the hydrogen economy and where your focus lies.
Yes, thanks so much, Owen, and always a privilege to be at these events. And maybe just building on Anna's comment, it's not just the energy system that we're changing. It's not just trying to decarbonize power. At the same time, we're also looking at what fuels transport. So what role is there for mobility? And it's very much intertwined with industrial strategy as well. So how do you avoid decarbonization becoming deindustrialization, in Europe, for instance? So it's an intricate kind of set of demands, providing more energy with lower emissions. And I'm really excited that in the midst of the the pandemic, as a company, we decided to double down on our climate goals to become a net zero company by 2050 or sooner, in lockstep with society. And what that actually means is not just taking care of our own scope 1 and 2 emissions, but also looking at the much harder part of the use of our products and the carbon that's emitted from that use case, so the so-called scope 3 emissions. And we've looked at many scenarios. Shell is well known for the brainpower behind scenario thinking, and we cannot envisage a path where hydrogen couldn't play an important role in getting to this net zero world, including reducing the carbon intensity of the products that we sell to our customers. So green hydrogen and in fact also blue hydrogen plays an important role in serving those demands and all of those parts of the energy system that electrons simply can't reach. So wherever direct electrification is either too expensive or not practical, that's where we see a role for hydrogen. Now, how far hydrogen actually is successful in that will depend on many other things and many other technologies that have to be developed. And we hope to be discussing some of those later today.
Absolutely, and for sure we will. Dr. Satyapal, again, thank you very much for joining us. Can you talk to us a little bit more around your role and also the roadmap for hydrogen and fuel cell technologies in the US?
Sure, and thank you again for the invitation. And I've been at DOE for many years now, over 17 years, and in industry before that, and hydrogen, fuel cells, again, for many years. And I think definitely seeing a lot of interest now, so I manage the portfolio. I'd like to start by just saying hydrogen is one part of a very comprehensive strategy. And as Paul said, we're looking at multiple resources. In the US, we produce 10 million metric tons of hydrogen per year, 1/7 of the global supply. And again, I think looking at diverse resources, renewables, obviously nuclear, fossil fuels with CCS. And we did publish a wide plan. Again, there are multiple offices involved. And as Paul said, hard to decarbonize sectors. So industry, steel alone is responsible for almost 8% of global emissions. Even cement manufacturing, ammonia production, heavy duty transport, and then also energy storage, especially long duration energy storage. So we have under this administration a goal of a clean grid by 2035, obviously carbon emissions free by 2050. But again, a very comprehensive portfolio, and we're focusing on cost reduction, but also scale up. So one of the key initiatives is what we call H2 at scale, and how do we really get the scale of hydrogen that's needed, carbon free, but end uses, and really show that value proposition. So I'll pause there, but a lot of interest, a lot of excitement.
Absolutely, and thank you, Sunita. Looking forward to coming back to some of those topics that you mentioned around electricity, industrial decarbonisation, and obviously the scale up piece as well, which is going to be key moving forward. But before we jump into that, I think you all kind of touched on the fact that this is part of a wider mix, and hydrogen as part of a wider solution to the dual challenge, obviously, that is facing us through the transition. So perhaps that's a place to start. And Paul, let's come to you first. How do we navigate this dual challenge, and what technologies do you think, alongside hydrogen, hold potential to fuel this transition?
Yeah, and I think what one of the things that fascinates me in my role is that I don't only get to talk with one sector of the energy system. I could be talking to a steel manufacturer in the morning, a data center operator later in the day, and a truck manufacturer later on about what needs to be done to accommodate other energy sources. And I think all of those companies and all of those customers are searching for how difficult it is and what is the abatement cost that they're able to carry as an industry. And I think one of the key elements that we see, and one of the reasons why we believe hydrogen is an elegant solution, is that it can couple these different demand sources. So the big industrial demand or the need for seasonal storage will create scale. That will bring the cost of hydrogen down, that then will make it a viable option for mobility to really take off. But a lot needs to happen before then, in terms of investing in how to safely get that hydrogen from the point of production to where the customer might need it. And that sounds easier said than done. If you look at a lot of the recent announcements, they're very much focused on increasing the production and the supply of hydrogen. In my day-to-day job, the issues that I face are all to do with the practical ways of how do you store, compress, safely transport the hydrogen to, for instance, refueling stations for mobility. And a lot of problems there are not yet solved, or certainly not reliable enough yet, because the supply chain just isn't deep enough.
Thanks, Paul. Perhaps Sunita, to pick up on that point. How are you seeing companies, or how are you looking in the US to navigate this dual challenge? Is there anything you'd add to Paul's comments there?
Sure. I think there's definitely a lot of momentum. Maybe one thing I'll add in our role. So again, we fund R&D, research development, as well as demonstrations. So we come in to help to de-risk some of the technology, especially when it comes to demos and early deployments, and complement what the private sector is doing. And I think one example that was pretty successful in our case is when we stimulated a niche market in the case of forklifts in the US. And so, for instance, this was over a decade ago. We said, here's an early market. It's very self-contained. There's value because in certain cases for multiple shifts, it's going to be cost prohibitive to use batteries and in terms of charging and so forth. So completely zero emissions in the warehouses. And a few challenges, in fact, with infrastructure and acceptance, safety codes and standards. But then after some demos, and then we funded a few hundred cost. Now there are over 40,000 in the US, and major companies are using them in their warehouses. So that's what helped to stimulate the infrastructure and drive down the cost and make it more viable. So I think this whole concept of how do we get to scale, but in the right strategic way. And so ideally, if we can co-locate some large-scale production, again, it'll be a combination of blue and green, and have the right off-takers so we can stimulate the market and really create that proposition. And so I think that regional concept is going to be really important as we look ahead.
No, absolutely. You talk around kind of building from Paul's point around scale and co-location and demos, etc., being part of that. Anna, is there anything you would add to that point Paul mentions around how we do get to scale and start to develop these technologies?
Yeah, well, I think for me it's very difficult to talk about a market failure when I don't see that we really have a market as of today. I think we're still building the market, and we're behind the point where we can talk about market failure. We need to really create that demand, and we need to do that through a comprehensive set of instruments, the right market design, the right regulatory frame, the right fiscal instruments, the right CO2 price signal. It's really a panoply of tools that are in the making, and we need to recognize that we really need to work on those to be able to have the right incentives for all agents in the society, the producers, the consumers, the infrastructure builders, the technology developers, to really make the right decisions. So I think we are at a point in time where governments and policymakers have realized the need to push for renewable hydrogen. So there's this compromise and this commitment to fully decarbonize, and awareness that the direct electrification will not do it all. And the awareness that we really need to promote the creation of this market, and setting a vision and setting targets, it's the way to start. And I think we are now at this point. We're seeing many countries and regions setting their own targets. This is the starting point. From there, we need to build on. We have the policy vision, we have the policy targets, now we need the policy tools, right? And we need them on the supply side, we need them on the demand side, and we need also to develop the infrastructure. And we need to do this in like Paul was describing, recognizing that this is an integrated energy system. We should no longer, be doing the traditional way of thinking in silos. This is the power sector, this is the gas sector, this is the oil sector or the coal, this is transport, this is electricity. No, this is really something that we need to put together. We need to recognize the interdependencies among the systems, and only when we coordinate the planning and the operation of these systems, we are really able to take advantage of the efficiencies And electrolyzers are the perfect example of something that really pulls together different applications, different use cases, different energy vectors, the electricity sector, the gas sector. So it's really, I would say, an excellent example of how different things, different sectors, different energy vectors come together. And so I guess we're
maybe if I can add, I have some technical issues here, seems to be frozen, but definitely agree with Anna's points. And maybe one other change, I think now compared to the low cost of renewables. So the fact that we're seeing, very low cost, that's what's enabling the low cost hydrogen. And then I think another factor that we haven't seen in the past, but Anna just, reminded me of that is changing quite a bit, is the fact that countries are realizing what are our climate goals. It's going to be hard to just rely on the electrons, and you can't import the electrons. And so a carbon-free molecule that, hydrogen be used for different end uses and, help them to meet their goals is one of the other areas that I think is, really driving the recent interest. So just wanted to add to that, but definitely agree with all of Anna's points as well.
Yeah, and just to emphasize, Sunita, that I was just reading a recent Bloomberg report that just shows you how much lower that cost of renewables really can get in certain parts of the world, and then how that feeds into potentially lower cost of renewable hydrogen. And I also remember running a team that looked at the future of some of these cost curves, and we had world experts in photovoltaics and wind that all had said, here's where the minimum level is. This is the asymptote. It will never be below this level. And we are now roughly at a quarter of what they predicted was really the ultimate kind of goal. So I think that gives a lot of hope, but it's only one part of the equation, right? So I think to Anna's point, it's not just about getting government incentives to build those first of a kind projects and learn and get down the cost curve. It's also about having the right structure in place that allows the premium for hydrogen to come down over time, and allow customers to adopt it through some mechanism, whether it's contracts for difference or other ways to bridge that gap between the cost of hydrogen and the cost of carbon and the abatement cost.
Sure. Thanks, Paul. And it's interesting to talk around that falling cost of electricity and the fact that can help with those green and blue hydrogens moving forward. Something that you also touched on, Anna, earlier was around those regulatory frameworks and pricing frameworks that need to be in place to help this move forward. So my question would really be about policy and policy makers. What role do governments play moving forward, and where do you see the most benefit that they could have for further rollout?
Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that they do play a central role in all of this. It's critical the way we design the policies. It's critical for the outcome that we will get. And so I think we really need to first promote the demand, create that demand. And to do that, we need to prioritize the use cases. We need to understand that renewable hydrogen is something very noble. It's expensive. So we should dedicate these resources to where it makes the most sense. So we should promote the use applications where we can abate the most CO2 and where there are no alternatives more cost efficient than these ones. And so we should have a clear understanding of how to prioritize the applications and promote the right ones. Promote through, support the industrial players to do the reconversion that they need in their equipment, or the buyers of fuel cells trucks, or whatever we understand it makes sense, we should then promote that demand. On the supply side, we really also need to have a clear definition of what renewable hydrogen is and what blue hydrogen is. So we need a clear taxonomy to understand that we also do the support the right way to do things. And when we talk about electrolyzers in particular, we also need to recognize that they do play a very important role by promoting the integration of renewables into the electricity system. So recognizing that they can and they should participate in ancillary services, providing capacity to the system and being able to stack different revenues, like batteries or other storage technologies, if that's the case, or like a flexible type of consumption. So recognizing that particular role. And then, of course, the infrastructures, the transport and all the logistics need to be in place. And just a final word on the need to coordinate all of that. We need to be very coordinated also cross-border, meaning that oftentimes we understand that countries are very engaged in developing their own policies, and without recognizing that exactly their neighbors are doing the same thing, and without sharing knowledge, without sharing the design of the instruments, and that's a potential source of inefficiencies even for the development of the infrastructures themselves. So we really need to be coordinated, cross-border coordinated, and coordinated through the energy sector.
Anna, Sunita, I think you were going to mention as well anything to lead on from there.
Yeah, no, just from the government perspective, I think there's both the regional and state-driven aspects. So for instance, in the US, California has been really successful, a real leader. So when you look at some of the policies like the low carbon fuel standards, the zero emission vehicle mandate, so some of those really help to drive the industry demand. We have over 9,000 vehicles, commercial vehicles here, for instance. Also, there's increasingly, obviously a lot of focus with the current administration, and in the jobs package mention production tax credits. And so we also have in the US, investment tax credits. When you look at stimulating solar, wind, it's really been a very comprehensive set of policies. And so both stimulating production, low cost production, getting to scale, but then also the end use. So the demand, the off-takers, I think that's where looking at what premium, for instance, would be acceptable for green steel or green ammonia. And those are the kinds of mechanisms I think that we'll see. But I also want to mention that with government, the role also includes R&D, because we're still not quite there. And when you look at how much R&D we're spending in other areas, even in combustion, we've all spent R&D for a century when it comes to batteries. A lot of next generation technology that's being developed. So even though there's been a lot of progress with electrolyzers, we're seeing $5 to $6 per kilogram for hydrogen cost with today's high volume, high cost electrolyzers at higher grid electricity prices. But we have to be less than $2 per kilogram. And so that's going to be a combination, even for some markets, even $1 a kilogram. So we really have to get the cost down, and it's a combination of the R&D, the innovation, and the right fees and incentives and the right framework across the board. And then finally, I just want to mention to Anna's point, there's been a lot of coordination internationally. So we have for over 17 years now the International Partnership for Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Economy, over 20 countries, clean energy ministerials, various missions. And so, for instance, some of what we're looking at is basically, for instance, facilitating international trade. So developing that framework, what is the greenhouse gas emissions on a life cycle basis for that hydrogen that's being exported or imported? And so we all need to make sure we're using the right analytical framework. What's the boundary conditions? You know, is the hydrogen really clean? So those types of activities have been underway at the government, you know, on the government side, and obviously have to continue.
Yeah, and it's a really important point. I'm really glad, Sunita, that you mentioned the California framework, because I think, in my mind, we have to make sure that also for regulators, we don't let perfect be the enemy of good enough. So there are a lot of really great things that we have benefited from in Shell, and understanding how the taxonomy of what is green hydrogen, how you get incentives for low carbon intensity hydrogen in a state like California, how you combine that with legislation like CARB to bring zero emission vehicles to market. And that's why we're building 50 stations in the state of California, because it works. The policy actually kind of overlaps. So for everyone to kind of learn from what works and what doesn't work, I think internationally is really, really helpful, so that not every country individually tries to come up with a perfect solution, because you'll find on the boundaries that really doesn't work. It's also a plea, I think, from a collaborative point of view in setting industry standards. This is something that we've been very vocal about, whether that's safety standards, whether that's standards for refueling vehicles, standards around the taxonomy of hydrogen, or indeed the much larger plays around hydrogen kind of transport and storage and large-scale electrolysis. So lots and lots of opportunity for international collaboration there.
Thanks, Paul. Interesting discussions we're having there around those policy frameworks. So thank you all for your thoughts there. A couple of questions coming in and linking back to that discussion we were having a little bit earlier around the grow out for green and blue. But the questions ask, and there's a couple here, really about grey hydrogen specifically. Kind of how do we transition away from that? Kind of how do we actually push that forward? And what role do you see grey hydrogen having in the future?
Yeah, and it's an important point, right? So if you think about the majority, let's say 97% of the hydrogen produced today, which is mostly used as feedstock in fertilizer, fuels, and petrochemicals, it is, of course, grey hydrogen, let's call it that. And I think there's an important role to try and capture as much of the CO2 produced in those hydrogen production units, mainly SMRs, to try and reduce the scope 1 and 2 emissions. What we do find is that it's much easier to build a greenfield facility where you can capture upwards of 95% of all of the CO2, you know, when you build a brand new facility. So I think over time, putting on CCS on existing brownfield sites has got a limited ability, because you're unlikely to get to net zero via that route. So we do see the phasing out of grey hydrogen by displacing it both with green hydrogen, where that's possible, but also looking at you know, hydrogen production with CCS in combination. Great example would be where we have an integrated play with an offshore windmill wind farm park in the Netherlands. I always say windmills because I'm Dutch. We love the things, but linking that to partly, of course, delivering electrons to customers, but then setting aside 200 megawatts towards large-scale electrolysis that can go directly into our big refining asset, and that refining asset is also turning more into a biofuels asset, so it actually has a bigger hydrogen demand than what it has today. And then whilst that is a flexible offtake, as the mobility side of the proposition grows, you take more and more of that hydrogen towards trucking, for instance, from the port of Rotterdam to where the trucks need to go further into Europe. So we do see the backing out of grey hydrogen as a great starting point for the bigger green and blue hydrogen plays.
Maybe just to add on Paul's thoughts, here, well, at EDP, we're fully focused on the green hydrogen and the renewable hydrogen. And actually we have some doubts on the future of blue hydrogen in this context of fully decarbonization, because it will not serve us if we don't go up to the 100%, you know, capture of the CO2. But also, apart from the environment, we also have an important concern in terms of energy policy, which is the security of supply and being independent in terms of your supply of energy is also an important point. And for countries like a lot of countries that don't have, you know, the fossil fuel resources, the independence issue, and on the other side that do have the renewable resources, so the promotion of green hydrogen makes a lot of sense. And apart from that, I would highlight some particularities of the green hydrogen technology when we compare to the blue technology, apart from the ability of capturing entirely or fully the emissions and being a decarbonized solution. And apart from that, hydrogen produced through electrolyzers have a particular characteristic of being very modular. It's a very modular technology. And because of that, we're able to size solutions according to, you know, the off-takers nearby, to a captive consumption or to, you know, a hub of hydrogen consumption. And so we're able to really do the right sizing of the production locally, and also take advantage of the renewable resources locally. And electrolyzers, like I mentioned before, also work as a piece of technology that connects the power sector with the gas and the off-takers. And so this is something that, of course, SMR don't do. So being able to provide this flexibility into the power system also facilitates the integration of more and more renewables into the power system itself. So these are particular technologies, particular characteristics of the green hydrogen technology that are very distinctive from the gray or the blue, the SMR.
Maybe one other thing I'll bring up, and agree with the comments on gray and green, but what doesn't get talked about too much is the nuclear to hydrogen. So there too, I just want to emphasize that, you know, it's clean energy. And then especially the question about the intermittency of renewables. And so here we have a couple of projects actually underway with our nuclear office, looking at nuclear to hydrogen and using solar, wind, and coming in with base load power, and low cost base load power when you don't have the solar or wind resources. So that optimization, because again, the electrolyzer is going to be low cost if you can utilize it as much as possible. If the capacity factor is only, you know, less than 40% or 25%, only when the wind is blowing or the sun is shining, then you're not going to have a good levelized cost. And so the other advantage of nuclear, again, as part of the portfolio, is with the high temperature and high temperature electrolyzers, you don't need as much electricity as with low temperature electrolyzers. So you actually have a much more efficient system, can produce more hydrogen. And so again, I think that that concept of, you know, not just the gray versus the green, but the fact that we have another resource here that can provide efficient, low-cost hydrogen and really at scale. So when we look at, you know, land use and so forth, there are a lot of benefits there to nuclear as well. I just wanted to bring that into the mix.
Yeah, thanks, Sunita. And there was a few questions around exactly that piece that had come in. So thanks for covering that off as well. To again broaden the scope beyond hydrogen itself, a question here asks around the role of ammonia and other hydrogen carriers, and the role that they can potentially play relative to hydrogen itself with regards to storage, fuel, feedstock. So perhaps if anyone had any thoughts on that, they could feed in.
Well, I can start. And oh no, go ahead. Shell actually has projects in the space, so go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, so we're we're obviously looking at any way you can connect those parts of the world where you have plentiful supply, let's say plentiful renewables, and those big demand centers where you have the demand, but you perhaps don't have the opportunity to build out on the same scale. And although I love hydrogen as a molecule, it's the most abundant element. It's wonderful in every way, shape, or form, except for shipping it. So either liquefying hydrogen, which is quite challenging in terms of getting so close to absolute zero, or you end up attaching it to another molecule, or indeed converting it into ammonia as a way of carrying it. That kind of eases your opportunity to ship the energy across large distances, but it then also becomes more tricky to convert and crack that ammonia back into hydrogen, depending on what the use case is. There are lots of potential opportunities to directly use the ammonia, and if that's the case, it's an interesting option. I think the jury is still out on what is the intermediate role of ammonia for direct use as a transportation fuel. It has some characteristics that make it quite interesting, but it is not a straightforward molecule to handle. I always say, I have this little bottle of water on my desk here. If I would spill that in this room, I would probably have to leave the house and not come back for a little while, because the lower exposure limits of ammonia are such that it's not an easy good. If that would happen in an engine room on a ship, I would want to make absolutely sure that you have all the precautions to make sure that that doesn't cause any harm to folks. So not an easy molecule to ship, but certainly something we're investigating, and we are part of a number of programs kindly sponsored by METI and the Japanese government. We're also very involved in some of the programs in the US and sponsored by the DOE, just to understand what is the best energy carrier to ship hydrogen over longer distances.
Maybe I'll just add as well that because it has higher energy density than hydrogen, as Paul said, there's just a lot of interest and efficiencies in transporting hydrogen in the form of ammonia. We also are looking at it, but I think one other area of interest is just the production of ammonia using green hydrogen. So not only through the traditional Haber-Bosch large central production method, but in the long term through a more innovative, more easily dispatchable modular method. So even electrochemical ammonia production. So once you have clean hydrogen or green hydrogen, that ammonia could be produced locally or regionally. And in the US, another high priority I wanted to mention is environmental justice, and especially showing the benefits of disadvantaged communities. And so there too, when it comes to the agricultural sector, and same with steel, for instance, but ammonia production as well. So can we make use of, for instance, plentiful wind in the Midwest, where a lot of the fertilizer is used, and have that more modular, easily dispatchable ammonia production, which also helps alleviate the need for the large infrastructure and shipping of the hydrogen. So both as a carrier, and there are other chemical carriers as well. So in addition to Paul's project, the project shipping liquid hydrogen from Australia to Japan, there's the methyl cyclohexane, again a liquid organic carrier. There are pros and cons, I think, in terms of all these different carriers. And so we've been doing quite a bit of analysis on the cost, and also internationally comparing not just the life cycle cost, but the life cycle emissions as well, the different carriers, because if you still have to get the hydrogen out, put the hydrogen back in, there's still challenges. But definitely a lot of interest in not just ammonia as a carrier, but how do we create that green ammonia locally.
Just to build on that, I fully agree with all that you said, and just to recognizing that we're really talking about the potential that the hydrogen production and the clean hydrogen production has to also reshape our industrial policies, because we're really talking about the potential to not changing the flows, not only changing the flows of energy, the imports and exports of energy, but also changing, your industrial capabilities of countries and and of regions. A region that typically was fully importing all the hydrogen or importing ammonia for the production of fertilizers now is able to be self-sufficient and locally produce green ammonia and locally produced green fertilizers or green steel or an industrial product that has a premium because it's green and it's locally produced. So actually, I do believe that we're really talking about something that has the potential to have major impact in our diplomacy, energy diplomacy, and also the industrial value proposition of countries and regions.
Thanks. Thanks, Anna and Sunita and Paul as well. Some really interesting points there. Paul, you also mentioned previously around connecting those areas that have high supply and also areas which are going to have kind of more demand for hydrogen moving forward. Anna, you also mentioned right at the beginning around the need to create a market for hydrogen. A question here actually asks more though around co-locating those markets where supply and demand is both high. What industries and regions do we see as a good fit for co-location, and where are the use cases that we can see? Paul, perhaps we'll come to you first.
We find almost the most natural hubs end up being industrial clusters around port areas, because you inherently have a lot of energy, and there's a reason why ports are shaped like that and why a lot of industry is there, because it uses the waterways, the deep sea ports and the like. So those are kind of the natural playing grounds where you have a lot of heavy industry that needs to decarbonize, and you probably start at those industries where hydrogen can be used as a feedstock. So is it steel making? Is it petrochemicals, kind of production, and then you might, use a fertilizer, and then you might just kind of branch out to other sectors that could use hydrogen. That gives you the scale. But of course, ports by their very nature are also places where there is a lot of mobility demand, including, all of the moving parts in a port area. So in the flow of traffic in and out of port areas. And it's quite interesting to see how, for instance, the Port of Long Beach, where you would have large queues of trucks all spewing out kind of emissions, could be cleaned up by something that basically only releases water into the atmosphere. I know it's a bit visionary and will take, it won't happen tomorrow, but we see that that's a really good starting point, because you have almost the ecosystem of clustered demand of industry and mobility in one spot.
Thanks, Paul. So industrial clusters and ports. Anna, also Sunita, is there anything you'd add there? Any further use cases?
I was just going to add that actually one of our flagship projects is around a port. It's in Sines in Portugal, and it's also around a coal power plant that is being decommissioned. And this also oftentimes coincides with ports and areas that are very industrialized, where you have a lot of infrastructures that you really need to repurpose, right? And so within the coal phase out process that we're going on in many places here in Europe in particular, we are coming to the conclusion that many of these assets and infrastructures and locations are really ideal to develop hubs around hydrogen and the energy transformation as a bigger value proposition, right? And so in Sines, in Portugal, we are together with other companies in a consortium really trying to understand how we could really design a project with a big ambition of having a 1 gigawatt by 2030 scale and really to export hydrogen to the north of Europe, to the Netherlands in particular. So it's a project with a big ambition that we are really we're developing, and also in the process of understanding exactly what the best carrier would be and what the local off-takers we would have. We have a refinery, local gas network as well. So potentially chemical industries also relocating to this area. So really these areas like Paul was describing, and under the concept of just transition in Europe, a lot of these projects and concepts around green hydrogen do fit.
Maybe the only other thing I'll add is just the importance of the basically the availability of infrastructure. So for us, and I agree with all the comments, but for instance, here we have certain regions, Texas, for example, that has large geological storage. In fact, the US has the world's largest geological storage cavern for hydrogen, gigawatt hours worth of storage. And then pipelines, there are over 1,600 or more miles of pipelines now. So also, looking in terms of deployment and really trying to focus those regions or clusters, looking at the availability of that infrastructure for large scale storage and transport will be important as well. For those natural formations in Utah as well, there's discussion about a really large project, several hundred megawatts with a turbine and salt caverns and so forth. So that's also an important and not trivial aspect of trying to get to the right type of location and infrastructure available for that large scale.
Thanks, Sunita. We've talked a lot, I think, so far around policy, technology, use cases, and essentially the opportunities that are there for growth. Something we perhaps haven't talked at specifically is really the barriers actually to achieving that, and of course they're multifaceted. If I could ask, perhaps what are the major barriers, or do you see as the key barriers to achieving further rollout of hydrogen, and any big sticking points that you could see along the roadmap? Paul, perhaps we'll come to you first.
Yeah, I think one barrier is that, so in my job, I get to read a lot of beautifully crafted reports with bar charts and pie charts and cost curves and all of that all make assumptions. So one of the barriers I see is that those cost curves are not a law of nature. They're not a given. They won't just happen by design. So as Sunita already mentioned, there is a significant need for ramping up our fundamental R&D in challenging some of the processes that we use for industrial use cases. There is significant steps that need to be made to reduce the cost of electrolyzers, the ramp up in production of fuel cells to make them affordable. Likewise, all of the components that go into fuel cell vehicles, as well as all of the infrastructure investments that have to be made. So there's so many different pieces of that puzzle that need to kind of come together. But I think what I see in all of those reports is just a kind of an assumption that that will all happen almost by default, because we have that positive use case where we've been pleasantly surprised by how fast the cost of renewables have come down. And I think one of the barriers is that, that is not a given. There will be a significant need for investment in infrastructure, investment in fundamental R&D. And of course, we talked quite a bit already about the regulatory framework that has to be really coherent and fit together so that people can make these long-term investment decisions to make the change happen.
Maybe I'll also add to that. I think the barrier, in addition to cost of the electrolyzer, for example, is also the infrastructure. So depending on the end use, for instance, if it's, let's say, heavy-duty long-haul trucks or vehicles in general, you still need to transport the hydrogen. You need to compress it. Today, they use high-pressure tanks, and that's not trivial either in terms of getting the cost down. And then if another approach, depending on the application, is liquid. And so there are 2 liquefaction plants. We have, roughly 10 or so announcements for additional liquefaction plants in the US, but these are also, quite energy intensive. And so, and costly as well. So it's the entire, I feel like there's a lot of focus on the electrolyzers and the production piece, which of course is necessary because the first step is low cost hydrogen production. And carbon-free, life cycle emissions is also not trivial. So we know that it's carbon-free from the production point of view, for instance, with electrolyzers, but looking at the entire value chain, transport, compression, liquefaction, the dispensing as well. So all of that in terms of getting the life cycle emissions down and then getting the cost down. I think those are some of the key barriers.
Well, it's very difficult to add something after what Paul and Sunita just mentioned. But when we're talking about producing renewable hydrogen through electrolyzers, so really a very important part of the cost component is the cost of electricity itself. It can represent 50 or even more percent of the total cost of hydrogen production. And that has made, an impressive learning curve, and the costs have decreased really fast, as you all know, and they will continue to do so. So they're not, stagnated. They will continue to learn, and onshore and offshore and solar, they will continue to reduce their costs. So that's, I would say, they have their path to pursue. So I think here we should really concentrate on reducing the investment costs. And really the investment cost is a question of scale. Of course, there's also R&D, there's also technology improvements, efficiency gains, but scale is critical. And getting scale in order to be able to have, efficiency gains from that scale, even in the manufacturing part, it's critical. And the only way we do that is through, the right regulatory framework, as we already described, and having the means to, de-risk the decision-making process. Investors, we're making decisions that will last for decades, and so it's a huge risk that investors will have to assume. And so, if we can have, a more clear visibility and credibility on, on policy, on CO2 pricing, on those alternatives, and able, instruments that are able to allocate those risks to those agents in the society that can better manage them, and sometimes are not the investors, sometimes are not the financial institutions, sometimes are governments or citizens themselves. So we really need to design instruments that do allocate risks to the agents that make more sense, so that share those risks in partnerships where we learn together and we do this effort together in a collaborative way. So I think this is a major challenge for all of us, yes.
Thanks, Anna. I'm aware that we have only a few minutes left, so a quick fire question to finish. Increasingly, it looks like hard to imagine a future energy mix and a successful transition, a successful net zero, which doesn't have hydrogen as a key component. Could you see hydrogen coming to dominate the space in the way that petrochemicals have in the past, or is really the future now more diversified? Paul, we'll come to you first again.
I think the future is more diversified in a way that direct electrification of demand, I think, is also going to have a really interesting journey. I think hydrogen will play a role where those electrons are really hard to use. But we've made a small investment in a company that is exploring flying on hydrogen. Is that a good idea? Is that an ultimate use case? We simply don't know. Maybe hydrocarbon fuels or biofuels are still the preferred route for long haul flight. So I think the future actually will have a more diverse energy mix than what we see today.
Thanks, Paul. Sunita, hydrogen domination or energy diversification?
I think hydrogen is already an essential chemical feedstock, so it's used. It's the fundamental building block of so many things. So from that perspective, I think we'll continue to see that. But in order for us to really meet the timelines, the really aggressive timeline to meet our climate goals, I think we have to have diversification. There's no one single silver bullet for any of these. And so I think there's a role depending on the sector, the application. We can get the cost down, the life cycle emissions down. I think we'll see that natural uptake in each of these areas. So diverse portfolio is needed, in my opinion.
Thanks, Sunita. And same question to finish, Anna.
Well, fully agree. We need to keep our options open. There's no single solution. in terms of energy vector, in terms of for the applications themselves. So we need to keep our option open, and hydrogen is just going to be one of them. The thing that will dominate is renewables, I think, being it, directly consumed through, as renewables themselves, through electrification, direct electrification, through indirect electrification like the hydrogen. So I think renewables for sure will dominate in many different ways, in many different, vectors and forms.
Thanks, Anna, and a nice way to finish. That is all we have time for. So once again, thank you to Paul, thank you to Sunita, and thank you to Anna for joining us today and sharing your expertise and insights with everyone tuned in. Thank you also to everyone who joined us live. Apologies if we didn't manage to get to your questions, and thanks to everybody now catching up on demand. The recordings will be sent out, so do watch out for those, and we hope to see you again in Energy Transition in June, and our Global Hydrogen event as well in May. In the meantime, thanks once more to our panelists and everyone tuning in today. We hope to see you all again very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.